The last thing Caleb Lawson expected on his way to pick up his daughter was to see a woman in a designer coat frantically waving her arms in the middle of the sidewalk. But there she was, her heels clicking against the pavement as she turned in circles, her face twisted in distress. "Please. Someone help," she cried, her voice high with panic. Caleb slowed his stride, his firefighter instincts kicking in despite being off duty. "What's wrong?" The woman turned, her deep brown eyes locking onto his. She was stunning, long, dark hair cascading over her shoulders, expensive earrings glinting under the streetlights. But she wasn't concerned about herself. "My cat, he ran under that car." She pointed to a sleek black sedan parked along the curb. "I can hear him crying, but I can't reach him." Caleb exhaled, lowering himself to the pavement. "All right, let's take a look." The woman crouched beside him, her perfume light and floral, a stark contrast to the grease-stained street. Caleb peered under the car, and sure enough, a small orange cat was wedged between the tires, trembling. "Come on, buddy," Caleb murmured, reaching out. The cat hissed, but the moment Caleb's strong, steady hands wrapped around it, it stopped resisting. Gently, he pulled the animal free and turned to the woman. She gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Oh my God, Felix." She scooped the cat into her arms, cradling him against her chest. Thank you so much," Caleb dusted off his hands, smiling. "No problem, just try to keep him inside next time." She laughed, the sound soft and warm. "I will, I swear." She looked up at him, her eyes lingering. "I don't even know your name." "Caleb," he said simply. "And you?" "Brielle," she answered. "Brielle Anderson." Something about the name tickled his memory, but before he could place it, his phone buzzed. His daughter. He was late. "Nice meeting you, Brielle. Take care of Felix." She opened her mouth as if to say more, but he was already turning away, jogging toward his truck. Brielle watched him go, her heart still pounding not just from the scare of nearly losing Felix, but from something else entirely. Caleb Lawson. She'd never met a man like him before. And for the first time in years, someone had walked away from her without knowing who she really was. Caleb hadn't thought about the woman with the runaway cat again. He had too much on his plate. Between his shifts at the fire station and raising his 6-year-old daughter, Lily, his life was packed to the brim. He had no time to wonder about a stranger on the sidewalk, no matter how striking she'd been. But fate had a strange sense of humor. It was a week later when he saw her again, this time, under very different circumstances. Lily had been invited to a classmate's birthday party at an upscale event space downtown. Caleb had expected the usual bounce house and pizza affair, but the moment he stepped inside with his daughter, he knew this was entirely out of his league. The place was decked out with chandeliers, a live string quartet, and waiters in crisp uniforms carrying trays of tiny, delicate hors d'oeuvres. He adjusted the collar of his button-down, suddenly aware it wasn't nearly as expensive as the other father's designer suits. Lily, however, was unfazed. She tugged at his hand, her excitement bubbling over. "Daddy, look at the princess cake." Caleb followed her gaze, and that's when he saw her. Brielle. Only now she wasn't the frantic woman chasing after a cat. She was poised, effortlessly elegant, wearing a fitted dress and speaking with a small group of parents. The way people gravitated toward her, the way the room seemed to shift around her presence, it was clear she wasn't just any guest here. And then it hit him. Brielle Anderson. Now he knew why her name had sounded familiar. She wasn't just some woman on the street. She was the Brielle Anderson, heiress to the Anderson luxury empire, one of the wealthiest families in the country. Before he could fully process it, her gaze lifted and locked onto his. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, then something warmer, something almost pleased. She excused herself from her conversation and walked straight toward him. "You," she said, a slow smile curving her lips. "I wasn't sure I'd ever see you again." Caleb tensed, unsure how to respond. He wasn't in the habit of crossing paths with billionaires. "Didn't realize you'd be here," he admitted. She glanced down at Lily, who was now tugging at Caleb's sleeve. "Daddy, can I go play?" He nodded, watching as she ran off toward the other children. Brielle folded her arms. "Let me guess." "Lily's here for Sophia's birthday," he exhaled, still adjusting to this revelation. "Yeah, your daughter, I assume." "My niece," she corrected. "I don't have kids." Caleb nodded, filing that piece of information away. Brielle tilted her head, studying him. "You look like a man who just realized he accidentally walked into a royal gala." "Something like that," he admitted. He glanced around. "Didn't expect this level of extravagance for a kid's party," she chuckled. "The Andersons don't do anything small." That much was obvious. A beat passed between them, the hum of conversation and music filling the space. Caleb wasn't sure why, but despite the opulence surrounding them, Brielle still felt like the same woman he'd met on the sidewalk. "Can I get you a drink?" she asked suddenly. He hesitated. The last thing he needed was to get tangled up in someone like her. But before he could refuse, she was already gesturing toward a waiter, seamlessly slipping back into conversation as if this were just another ordinary day. And maybe, for her, it was. But for Caleb, nothing about this was ordinary. And something told him that this woman, this impossibly wealthy, confident woman, was about to make his life a whole lot more complicated. Caleb hadn't meant to get pulled into conversation with Brielle. He'd meant to keep his distance, let Lily enjoy the party, and then get out of there before he stuck out any more than he already did. But Brielle had a way of steering things effortlessly, and before he knew it, he was standing at the edge of the ballroom with a glass of whiskey in his hand, listening to her talk. "I still can't believe we ran into each other like this," she mused, her gaze flickering toward the children laughing near the oversized balloons. "I never got to thank you properly for saving Felix." He took a slow sip of his drink. "You already did." "No, I panicked and ran off with my cat." "That's not the same thing." She turned to face him fully, her expression unreadable. "I should have invited you for coffee or something." He arched a brow. "You ask every man who helps you out to coffee." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "Not exactly." "But you didn't know who I was that night. You weren't helping Brielle Anderson, billionaire. You were just helping a woman with a lost cat. That doesn't happen to me often." Caleb studied her, noting the way her demeanor shifted ever so slightly when she said that. Like she wasn't used to people seeing her as just a person. "I didn't realize who you were until I got here," he admitted. "Didn't expect to be at a party hosted by one of the wealthiest families in the city." She tilted her head, as if weighing his words. "And now that you do know," he shrugged, "doesn't change much. You're still the same person I met on the street." Something flickered across her face, something he couldn't quite name. Then, just as quickly, she masked it with a teasing tone. "So you're saying you're not intimidated?" He gave her a dry look. "I run into burning buildings for a living. A fancy party isn't going to shake me." She laughed again, something genuine in the sound, but before she could reply, a woman approached. She was older, elegant in a way that suggested she'd been born into wealth. "There you are, darling," she said to Brielle, barely sparing Caleb a glance. "I was starting to wonder where you disappeared to." Brielle's posture stiffened slightly. "I was just catching up with a friend." The woman's eyes finally flicked toward Caleb, assessing him in a way that made it clear she didn't think he belonged. "I see." Caleb didn't need a formal introduction to know who she was. This had to be Brielle's mother. The resemblance was there, in the sharp cheekbones and the way she carried herself like she owned every room she entered. "I don't believe we've met," the woman said, though it didn't sound like an invitation for pleasantries. "Caleb Lawson," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "And what is it you do, Mr. Lawson?" Brielle exhaled. "Mom, I'm a firefighter," Caleb answered, unbothered by the scrutiny, her lips pressed together in a way that made it clear she was unimpressed. "Ah, I see," Brielle sighed. "Mom, please." Her mother didn't look at her, her gaze still lingering on Caleb, as if trying to decipher why her daughter was speaking to him at all. Then, just as quickly, she shifted her attention back to Brielle. "We need to speak with the event planner. There's been an issue with the catering schedule." Brielle hesitated, glancing at Caleb. He gave her a nod. "Go ahead." She looked like she wanted to say something else, but instead she gave him a small smile before following her mother. Caleb exhaled, rolling his shoulders. He didn't fit in here, that much was obvious. But for some reason, Brielle didn't seem to care about that, and that was the part that confused him the most. He finished his drink, glancing over at Lily, who was now engaged in a very serious conversation with another little girl about the best flavor of cake. Maybe this would be the last time he'd see Brielle. Maybe they'd go their separate ways after tonight, and this whole thing would just be a strange coincidence. But deep down, he had a feeling that wasn't going to be the case, because Brielle Anderson wasn't the kind of woman who faded into the background, and Caleb wasn't sure he wanted her to. Caleb hadn't expected Brielle to seek him out again after the party. She belonged to a world of wealth and status, and he had no illusions about where he stood in comparison. But just 2 days later, she showed up at the fire station. He had just finished a long shift, exhaustion weighing on his bones, when the familiar sleek black car pulled up outside. Brielle stepped out, dressed in tailored slacks and a silk blouse that somehow looked effortless on her. The sight of her standing there, outside a place so far removed from her world, sent a strange jolt through him. "You tracked me down," Caleb said, wiping his hands on a towel as he approached. Brielle lifted one shoulder in a small shrug. "I asked around." Turns out finding a firefighter named Caleb Lawson isn't as difficult as I thought. He crossed his arms, studying her. "And why exactly did you want to find me?" Her lips curved, but there was something uncertain in her eyes. "I never got that coffee with you, thought I'd fix that." Caleb exhaled, torn between amusement and something he couldn't quite name. He wasn't blind to the fact that people like Brielle didn't usually go out of their way for men like him. But there was something about the way she looked at him, like she wasn't here out of pity or amusement, but because she genuinely wanted to be. "I just got off shift," he admitted. "So if you don't mind a guy covered in ash and sweat, I guess I could use a cup of coffee." Her smile widened. "I think I'll manage." They ended up at a small cafe a few blocks away, one Caleb frequented after long nights at the station. It was nothing fancy, nothing like the five-star places Brielle was probably used to, but she didn't seem to mind. If anything, she looked comfortable. They took a seat by the window, and for the first time, Caleb let himself really look at her. Not as the woman from the Billionaire Anderson family, but just as Brielle. "You don't seem like someone who usually chases after strangers to buy them coffee," Caleb remarked, taking a sip from his mug. Brielle tilted her head, considering him. "I don't, but you're not really a stranger, are you?" He raised a brow. "I think we qualify." She shook her head. "You saved my cat, that puts you in a different category." Caleb huffed a quiet laugh. "That all it takes?" "No," she admitted, stirring her drink, "but it's a start." A pause settled between them, the hum of the cafe filling the space. "Your mother didn't seem too thrilled about me at the party," Caleb finally said, watching her reaction. Brielle sighed, leaning back in her chair. "She has expectations, and a very clear idea of the kind of people I should associate with. And I don't fit the mold." She met his gaze without hesitation. "Maybe that's a good thing." Caleb studied her, reading between the lines. Brielle wasn't just here because of some fleeting interest. She was here because she wanted something real, something beyond the carefully curated life she lived. "Is that why you're here?" he asked. "Because I'm not like the people you usually know." Brielle shook her head. "I'm here because I wanted to see you again." The simplicity of her words hit him harder than he expected. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Brielle reached across the table, fingers brushing against his. It was a small gesture, barely there, but it sent a current of something undeniable through him. Caleb had spent years keeping his world small, protecting Lily, protecting himself. But Brielle was slipping through the cracks, and he wasn't sure he wanted to stop her. Maybe he didn't have to. Caleb wasn't sure what to make of Brielle's presence in his life. She didn't fit neatly into any part of his world, yet she kept showing up, slipping past the barriers he usually kept in place. And, against his better judgment, he let her. Their coffee outing had stretched into a long conversation, one where she asked about Lily, about his work, about the things that mattered to him. She listened, not out of politeness but with genuine interest, and by the time they stood outside the cafe, the space between them felt charged with something unspoken. Now, days later, Caleb found himself looking for her in places he shouldn't. When he dropped Lily off at school, when he stopped for coffee, when he walked home from his shift. He told himself it was nothing, just curiosity, but deep down, he knew better. Then she appeared again, this time outside the fire station just as he was finishing a training session with his crew. Brielle leaned against her car, arms crossed, watching him with an amused expression as he wiped sweat from his brow. "You're persistent," Caleb noted, walking toward her. She glanced at the fire trucks behind him. I wanted to see what you do when you're not rescuing cats or making me question my entire social circle. He exhaled, shaking his head. I'm guessing your mother wouldn't approve of this visit either. She wouldn't, Brielle admitted. But that's not going to stop me. Caleb studied her for a moment, then gestured toward the station. Come on, I'll show you around. Brielle didn't hesitate, following him inside. The other firefighters gave her a few curious glances, but no one said anything. She wasn't the first outsider to tour the place, but she was definitely the most unexpected. He led her through the garage, showing her the trucks, the equipment, the gear they used. She listened intently, her fingers occasionally grazing the metal of the fire engine as if trying to understand it through touch. This is a whole different world, Brielle murmured, looking up at the towering truck in front of her. I spend my days in boardrooms, staring at stock reports. And you? She turned to face him. You run into burning buildings. It's what I signed up for, Caleb said simply. Brielle's gaze softened. It's more than that, you save people. He shrugged, uncomfortable with the weight of her words. It's a job. No, she shook her head. It's a calling. Caleb didn't respond to that, but something about the way she looked at him made him feel seen in a way he wasn't used to. Before he could dwell on it, a voice called from across the garage. Lawson. You sticking around or heading out? Caleb turned, nodding toward one of his fellow firefighters. I'm leaving in a minute. Brielle raised a brow. Busy day, always, Caleb said, but I've got time to walk you out. As they stepped into the sunlight, Brielle glanced at him, hesitating. I like being around you, Caleb, he exhaled, raking a hand through his hair. Brielle, I know, she interrupted. We come from different worlds, I get it. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the same conflict in her eyes that he felt in himself. Then why are you here? Caleb asked, his voice quieter now. Brielle held his gaze. Because I don't care about the differences, I care about you. The words settled between them, heavy and undeniable. Caleb had spent years keeping his life simple, focused on Lily, his work, and nothing else. But Brielle wasn't simple. She was complicated, unexpected, and entirely impossible to ignore. And for once, he wasn't sure he wanted to. Caleb had spent years making practical choices, keeping his life focused on what mattered, raising Lily, protecting his crew, and staying clear of anything that could disrupt the stability he had built. But Brielle, she was a disruption in the best and worst ways. After her visit to the firehouse, she didn't disappear. Instead, she kept finding ways into his world. She showed up at the local farmer's market where he and Lily shopped on weekends, claiming she was simply trying to experience something outside of her usual circles. She texted him links to articles about fire safety, as though she needed an excuse to keep the conversation going. And most unexpectedly, she found ways to bond with Lily. It had started with something small. A chance meeting at the park where Brielle had been visiting her niece, Sophia, and Lily had immediately dragged her into an impromptu tea party. Caleb had expected Brielle to be out of place, to make an excuse to leave, but she hadn't. She had sat cross-legged in the grass, listening with genuine interest as Lily explained the importance of proper tea etiquette for stuffed animals. Even now, days later, Caleb couldn't shake the image of Brielle in the sunlight, her laughter blending with Lily's as though she belonged there. But belonging was the problem, because no matter how much he tried to pretend otherwise, Brielle's world was still vastly different from his own, and it was only a matter of time before reality caught up with them. That moment arrived sooner than he expected. A gala invitation appeared in his mailbox, the envelope so crisp and formal it felt out of place against the bills and school notices. The card inside bore Brielle's name, an elegant request for his presence at the Anderson Foundation's annual charity event. Caleb stared at it for a long time, debating whether to ignore it entirely. Then his phone rang. You got it, didn't you? Brielle's voice carried a mix of nerves and excitement. I did. And, Caleb exhaled, leaning against the counter. Brielle, I appreciate the invite, but I don't think a black tie event is my scene. She didn't hesitate. It's not about the event, Caleb. It's about me wanting you there. That was the problem, because if he went, it wouldn't just be as her guest. It would be as the man standing beside her, in front of her world, in front of her family. It would mean acknowledging that whatever was happening between them wasn't just casual, and that terrified him. But when he arrived at the gala, dressed in a rented tuxedo that felt too stiff against his skin, and saw Brielle waiting for him at the entrance in a deep blue gown that shimmered under the chandeliers, he knew there had never been another choice. Her expression softened the moment she saw him. "You came," Caleb nodded, adjusting his cuffs. "Figured someone had to keep you from getting lost in all this luxury." She laughed, slipping her hand into his. "Then I guess you're stuck with me tonight." The evening was a whirlwind of introductions and hushed whispers from guests who clearly weren't used to seeing Brielle with someone who didn't belong to their inner circle, but she never wavered. She stayed close, her fingers lingering on his arm, her attention never drifting, but the real test came when her mother approached. "You made quite the entrance," the older woman remarked, her gaze sharp as she took in Caleb's presence. Brielle's grip tightened on his hand. "Mother, be nice." "I am being nice," she said smoothly. "I'm simply curious about where this is going." Caleb met her stare evenly. "With all due respect, ma'am, that's something only Brielle and I get to decide." A flicker of something approval perhaps crossed her features before she turned away, dismissing them with a nod. Brielle let out a breath, tilting her head toward Caleb. "Well, that went better than expected," he chuckled. "I'll take your word for it." As the night continued, Caleb found himself relaxing into Brielle's world in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't just about the wealth or the prestige, it was about her. The way she lit up when speaking about the Foundation's work, the way she made sure he never felt out of place, the way she looked at him as though he was the only thing that mattered in a room full of people. And when the music slowed and Brielle pulled him onto the dance floor, pressing her body close to his, he stopped fighting what had been inevitable from the start. "I don't think I can walk away from this," Caleb murmured, his lips brushing against her temple. Brielle looked up at him, her eyes shining. "Then don't." He didn't. Weeks passed, and their worlds continued to intertwine in ways neither had anticipated. Brielle spent more time in his neighborhood, meeting Lily for ice cream after school, slipping into his life with a kind of ease that made it impossible to imagine a time without her. And then, one evening, as the sun set over the city skyline, Caleb took her to the rooftop of his apartment building, a quiet place where he often went to think. Brielle stood by the railing, looking out over the view, unaware of the way Caleb's heart pounded in his chest. When she turned, he was already lowering himself onto one knee, her breath caught, her hands flying to her mouth. "I never thought I'd find someone like you," Caleb said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. "Someone who could see past the differences, past the expectations, someone who could love me for exactly who I am." Tears welled in her eyes. "I love you, Brielle, and I want forever with you." He opened the small velvet box, revealing the ring inside. "Marry me." A tear slipped down her cheek as she nodded, laughter and sobs mixing together. "Yes. 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger before pulling her into his arms, holding her as tightly as he could. And for the first time in years, Caleb knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. Their wedding was a perfect blend of both their worlds, a ceremony that celebrated love without the constraints of expectation. Lily stood proudly beside them as Brielle became part of their family, and as Caleb kissed his wife beneath a sky full of stars, he knew that no matter how different their lives had once been, they had found something rare, something unshakable. A love that defied everything. And it was theirs forever.